Many churches and Christians have a tradition of holding the KJV in high esteem, high regard, and believe it is the only true translation of the Bible. And they tend to be condemning of modern translations. Now, this message is not talking about those that use the KJV, but are still accepting of other translations. That's not who I'm dealing with. When I talk about unbiblical practices, I'm talking about people that use the KJV and believe that it is superior to all other translations. For many of them, they believe that the KJV, the English version of the KJV, is the only God-authorized version that we should be using. I even heard of some KJV only Christians that won't even delve into the original languages, which is the Greek and the Hebrew, because they believe that the KJV is God's word in its perfect form, regardless of the Greek or Hebrew. So, in our discussion about the KJV today, this is not to bash it as a translation. It's a very good translation that has stood the test of time. The goal of this teaching is also not to bash those that have a KJV only mindset. However, it is to educate them and all of us about the KJV, its origins, where it came from, so that we can form our opinion from an educated standpoint, and other translations, and we can kind of view it from an informed perspective, not just tradition. Amen? Mm-hmm. So, in order to understand how the King James Version came to be, I have to take you on a bit of a history lesson. So ride with me. This is going to be I have a lot of stuff to get through, but trust me, it'll make sense as we go through this journey in time. Now, the creation of the KJV and a lot of our English versions are deeply rooted in the political climate that kind of spanned through the centuries. So we have to go back to the Roman Empire. So when we look at this map, this shows the Roman Empire in the first century. So it kind of shows how far the Roman Empire got. So understand, this would have been at the time really the largest empire in the known world. Remember, North America hadn't been discovered yet, so that whole hemisphere, wasn't known about. This area would have been what they known to exist. So remember, Rome sits here, but all of this is Roman Empire. So it extended from Great Britain all the way over here to Armenia, Syria. So it goes out here this is roughly like Iraq, Iran, Persia, all that stuff. So, and into, as you can see here, into North Africa. So this is Mauritania. This would be Libya or Algeria, roughly around here. Egypt. And we also know, not necessarily the Roman Empire, but we know Christianity spread down into Ethiopia as well. But here we have a rough layout of where how the Roman Empire expanded. Now, like I said, during the height of the Roman Empire, its reign spread from Western Europe to parts of Turkey. This is a huge region and represented a large portion of the known world at the time. Now, during the time of Jesus, Greek would have been used as the common universal language at the time. So the majority of people in this known world would have spoken Greek. As Romans conquered new territories, they allowed the conquered people to continue a lot of their practices and customs. We see this with the Israelites, with the Jews. Even though a lot of them were in Jerusalem, they still were able to practice their own customs, had their own system within the Roman government. All of this area eventually becomes way too much for Rome to hold on to, and the Roman Empire becomes strained under the weight of its own success. So the Roman Empire eventually begins to decline, and it splits in two. So it splits into East and West. So the one empire ends up becoming two. So if we go back to the roots of Christianity, as it splits to the east, the dominant denomination, if you will, becomes the Eastern Orthodox Church. You may have heard about that. To the west would have been the Roman Catholic Church. So if you've heard about those two of the oldest denominations, that would have been how they started. Now, the Roman Catholic Church, and that's the church I'm going to deal with, because as we talk about our English translations, that's where it would have evolved from. So, the Roman Catholic Church eventually, like I said, most of Rome, or most of this area, would have spoken Greek. As the Roman Empire declines, local dialects become popular again. So the Roman Catholic Church ends up adopting Latin as its official language. So that's how we get Latin. So around 400 AD, a Catholic pope at the time, Pope Damascus, commissions a priest named Jerome of Stridon. Show y'all a picture of Jerome. See, I thought Jerome was a black dude. Nope. But Jerome, who's Jerome of Stridon, whose actual name was Eusebius Sophronius Hieronymus, but he was known as Jerome of Stridon. He becomes known because he takes the Greek and Hebrew and he translates it into the Latin Vulgate. The Vulgate is a Latin root. It's where we get our word vulgar from. Vulgar just meaning common. So the Latin Vulgate was supposed to be a common Latin Bible for people to use. So like I said, the Roman Catholic Church, Latin was their official language, and Jerome's Latin Catholic translation becomes the standard translation for the Catholic Church for about 1,000 years. Okay? As the Catholic Church spreads further west into Britain, there becomes a desire for the Bible to be translated into Middle English, which is what they spoke at the time. So to go back to the map, we see it begins to spread into Britain. So you see Londinium right here, that becomes London. But the Roman Catholic Church begins to spread into Britain. That's where they spoke Middle English. They actually wanted the Bible in their own language. However, the Catholic Church, like I said, Latin was the official language. So they forbid the Bible from being translated from Latin to any other language. So it was illegal from the Catholic Church's standpoint to translate the Bible into anything other than Latin. So an English version was out of the question. But that didn't keep a lot of English translations from springing up over the centuries. So now, this is a chart. This actually shows the lineage of our English translations. So if you look here, you have ancient copies, ancient versions. Right here we have the Latin Vulgate, which is around 400 AD. Okay, like I said, Catholic Church spreads into Great Britain. They wanted it in Middle English. So a British Catholic priest named John Wycliffe illegally printed the Bible in English in 1380. We see that here. Matter of fact, let me pull up a picture of, here he is, John Wycliffe, 1380. Like I said, he printed these Bibles illegally. So he was in big trouble with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church actually bans his Bible. No one's allowed to read it. They labeled him a heretic. As a matter of fact, so much so, 40 years after he was dead, the Catholic Church digs his bones back up and burns them. Okay? Now, 1517, a Catholic priest named Martin Luther, you may have heard about him. He believed that the Catholic Church had become corrupt. This was in 1517. He believed that the Catholic Church had become corrupt and begins a movement known as the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation. A lot of you have heard the term Protestant. It's what most people that aren't Catholic consider themselves. So he begins that whole movement, the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Protestant Reformation eventually splinters into a bunch of different denominations that we're all kind of descended from, but he actually starts that movement, that break away from Catholicism. Now, the Protestant movement spreads across Europe in opposition to the Catholic Church. The spread of the Protestant movement becomes a threat to the Catholic Church. And this conflict begins to have a direct impact on politics and the production of English Bible translations. So, in 1525, William Tyndale, a British Catholic priest, illegally translates the New Testament into English and smuggles them into English from Germany. So again, we go from the Latin Vulgate to Wycliffe's version of 1380. Tyndale does the New Testament in 1525. So this is what he looks like. Now, William Tyndale, for his efforts, in 1536, he is strangled and burned at the stake. Because again, it's illegal to print, by the Catholic Church, it's illegal to print the Bible in any language other than Latin. But he becomes known as the father of the English Bible. Now, in 1539, I'm skipping a few for the sake of time, but Coverdale does the Bible in 1535, Matthews 1537. I'm going to jump down here to 1539 with the Great Bible. Now, the Great Bible is commissioned by King Henry VIII. You should be familiar with this gentleman. For those of y'all that are theater folk, you know the play Six? This is the dude that was killing all of his wives. So, King Henry was a Catholic, but he established his own church so he could divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So, King Henry establishes the Church of England. Are you familiar with that? The Church of England. So, because he started his own church so that he could divorce his first wife, because the Pope would not grant him an annulment. So, King Henry runs what's called the Church of England. He becomes the head of it. If you know anything about King Henry VIII, he was quite a character. He beheaded a lot of his wives for various reasons. He's just a very prominent figure in history, especially in British history. Now, King Henry dies in 1547 and is succeeded by, before I get there, King Henry actually commissions the Great Bible. He actually commissions the Great Bible. Okay? So now, King Henry dies in 1547, and he is succeeded by his son, who was 9 years old at the time, but Edward VI. So this is young Master Edward. Now, Edward becomes the head of the Church of England and remains in power until his death in 1553 at the age of 15. Now, after Edward's death, his half-sister, Mary Tudor, she becomes the reigning monarch. Now, Mary Tudor was Catholic. So understand, during that time, you have different Protestant denominations. It's Protestant versus Catholic, and it goes back and forth depending on who's in power at the time. And when I say Protestant, I'm not necessarily talking about Protestant, because remember, I told you it's splintered into a bunch of different denominations. You would have had Quakers, Puritans, all these other denominations that began to spring up under the banner of Protestantism. But again, with this, we're talking about the Church of England. But Mary Tudor is a Catholic, so she brings the kingdom back under Catholic rule. She is known as Bloody Mary because of the violent way she tamped out the Protestant movement. So, as a result of her oppression against Protestants, many of the Protestant leaders flee to Geneva, Switzerland. They flee to Geneva, Switzerland to escape the persecution. These Protestant leaders create what's known as the Geneva Bible. You see that right here. The Geneva Bible, which is 1560. Now, so they create the Geneva Bible and smuggle them back into England. The Geneva Bible actually becomes the most popular English translation at the time and remains so for 100 years. This is actually the first Bible that made it to America with the Pilgrims. It was not the King James Version. The Geneva Bible is the first Bible to make it to America's shores. The first Bible to make it to the New World. All right? Now, in 1558, after Queen Mary's death, she is succeeded by Queen Elizabeth I. Not the queen that just passed. This is her distant cousin. All right? So, Queen Elizabeth II, who was the one that we're familiar with, again, this would have been her cousin. So she becomes the Queen of England, and she restores the Church of England. Now, she commissions the Bishop's Bible. So we see the Bishop's Bible right here, 1568. The Bishop's Bible, she commissions that as a counter to the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible had a lot of notes in it, and in those notes they were actually critical of the monarchy. So those that were monarchs had a lot of issues with that. So she commissions the Bishop's Bible to counteract the Geneva Bible. So again, remember, although the Geneva Bible was extremely popular, it was also illegal and not authorized by any monarch. Monarchs, like I said, disliked the translation because it was very critical about them. Now, in 1542, Mary Stuart, also known as Mary Queen of Scots, she becomes a queen in Scotland. Okay, so if you know anything about Great Britain, you have Britain, Scotland, and Ireland. They're all clustered right there together. And each of the three, even though they're that close in proximity, they all were very different and distinct. So she actually becomes Queen of Scotland at the same time as Queen Elizabeth is reigning in England. Okay? So, because of her lineage, she was actually a direct heir. She was a direct heir to the throne of England. She was the first cousin of Queen Elizabeth. All right, so they were related. However, in 1567, amid a rebellion and political turmoil, Mary is forced to give up her throne. So she fled to England. Under the protection of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth, and had to leave her 1-year-old son, James, behind in Scotland. That is, yes, this would be the mother of King James. So the James that I'm talking about is the King James that we're going to discuss in just a moment. But she had to flee, so she left him behind. Now, he was actually raised by Protestants, but I'll get there in just a second. Now, like I said, Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, was a direct heir to the throne in England. So, Mary's cousin, Queen Elizabeth, fearing Mary's claim to the throne and Catholic opposition, has Queen Mary of Scots, that's Mary Stuart, she has her killed. so that she cannot make a claim to the throne. Now, after the death of Queen Elizabeth, here we go. After the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1603, James, the son of the deceased Queen of Mary of Scots, okay, that's his mother, that's James. He becomes the King of Scotland and ends up becoming the King of England and ends up becoming the King of Ireland. So he was the first monarch to actually reign over all three kingdoms. So he goes from being known as King James VI when he was reigning just over Scotland and becomes King James I. All right. This King James would become the monarch to authorize the creation of what we now know as the King James Bible. So let's learn some interesting facts about King James. First, King James did not write the Bible. He did not rewrite the Bible, nor did he change the Bible. He simply authorized the translation of it. Another fact that I was shocked to find this out. He had an interest in the occult and witchcraft. He authored a book on the occult called Demonology. This is prior to him commissioning the King James Version. But you see here, Demonology, information of a dialogue divided into 3 books written by the high and mighty Prince James, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland. That's kind of a little title they use, but he didn't rule over France. Defender of the faith. So King James actually was responsible for witch hunts and burned approximately 25 people at the stake. 84% of them, of course, were female. King James had a close relationship with several men. Esme Stewart, Robert Carr, George Villars. He was known to write affectionate poetry and letters to these gentlemen. This has led many historians to believe that King James may have had a romantic relationship with them. Okay? You can research this stuff. I'm just putting the information out there. King James also believed in what's called the divine right of kings. The divine right of kings, meaning he felt that he and other monarchs were divinely appointed by God and was not accountable to any earthly authority. Here's a direct quote from King James. He read this to English Parliament. The state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth. For kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself are called gods. That was his mindset. Now, remember I told you guys about the turmoil that was going on throughout the centuries. This battle between Protestantism, Catholicism, back and forth. As time goes on, like I said, Protestantism splinters off into a bunch of denominations. So Protestantism now becomes in turmoil. King James, in an effort to establish himself politically and address the religious divisions that were just kept mounting, he commissions a new Bible. And that Bible, in 1604, he commissioned a new Bible. And in 1611, it was completed, and it was known as the Authorized Version, later to be known what we know as the KJV. So if I say the Authorized Version and the King James Version, or the King James Bible, they're all exactly the same thing. All right? So this 1611 version actually included the Apocrypha. Remember, we talked about the Apocrypha when I discussed the history of the Bible. The Apocrypha was written, those are books written between the period. You have the Israelites going into exile And there's like a 400-year period where the Israelites go into exile and Jesus coming on the scene. So there's this silence there. That's when those books would have been written. So they were not necessarily considered authoritative, which is why they're not in our Bible today. However, they still remain in most Catholic Bibles. King James bans the Geneva Bible from being printed and imported in 1616. This allows the King James Version to overtake the Geneva Bible's position as the most popular Bible. Now, none of these facts that I've stated disqualify the KJV as a translation, but I do think it's important that we understand the background and the climate through which this translation came about. Amen? So, when it was initially published, the KJV contained, or the authorized version, contained a lot of translation errors. It was revised several times to correct errors and standardize punctuation. Like I said, the initial 1611 version included the Apocrypha. Most King James versions that we use today are the 1769 revision. The KJV was actually a revision of the Bishop Bible and a lot of the other Bibles that preceded it, the English versions that preceded it. And like I said, the Bishop's Bible was the one that was created by Queen Elizabeth I in response to the Geneva Bible. Now, you guys that were here, do you remember during the boot camp series, I said you can find information on the Bible's translation philosophy, the scholars that translated it, etc., etc. Y'all remember me saying that? So now, if you look in the front of the King James Version that we have today, and you try to go and look for those same notes, you won't see a preface there. It normally goes straight to the table of contents and straight to the book of Genesis. However, it did have a preface when it started, okay, when it was initially published. You can actually find it online. If you look in your notes, you'll actually see a link to it there. But when the authorized version, or the KJV, was first released, it did have that preface that talked about translation philosophy and all that stuff. Now, I have a digital copy of the Cambridge Paragraph Bible, which is one of the versions of the authorized. If you know anything like Zondervan, different things like that, they will publish different Bibles. So Cambridge is one of the oldest publishing houses out there. They did a version of the authorized version. So I have one from 1873 in my Bible software. So we're going to actually take a look at some snippets of the preface in the KJV. And when you actually see this, you will learn some very interesting facts about it. Let's see, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I just wanted to pull a few snippets out, okay? Now, this is 17th century English, so I'm going to have to translate a little bit for y'all, but as I translate, I think you'll get it. There we go. So this is what the cover looked like. The Holy Bible, containing the Old Testament and the New, etc., etc. So then now we go in and look at the prefaces. So this is it, from the translators to the reader. Truly good Christian reader, we never thought from the beginning that we should need to make a new translation, nor yet to make of a bad one a good one, but to make a good one better, or out of many good ones, one principal good one, not justly to be accepted against, that hath been our endeavor, that our mark. So, to kind of translate, The translators of the Authorized Version, or the 1611 KJV, did not undertake the translation of the Bible to create a new version per se. Their goal was to consolidate the translations that preceded it into one widely accepted one. So again, it just goes to point to the KJV being, it did use the original manuscripts that they had at the time, but it also was a revision of the English versions that preceded it. So this speaks to that. Out of many good ones, many good English translations, one principal good one. All right, let's keep going. Zeal to promote the common good, whether it be by devising anything ourselves or revising that which hath been labored by others, deserveth certainly much respect and esteem, but yet findeth but cold entertainment in the world. It is welcomed with suspicion instead of love, and with emulation instead of thanks. And if there be any hole left for cavil to enter, it is sure to be misconstrued and in danger to be condemned. Now, this is the opening paragraph of the section entitled "From the Translator to the Reader." So here, and I know you can't read the text, but that's literally this text right here. Now, the translators were hoping that their work would be widely received and regarded. However, the news of their translation was actually met with skepticism and controversy. Their endeavor actually received the same type of criticism that KJV only purists apply to modern translations. So we see here, they labored and certainly expected to have much respect and esteem, but findeth cold entertainment in the world. Basically, it wasn't received that warmly once it was released. Let's keep going. Many men's mouths have been open a good while, and yet are not stopped, with speeches about the translation so long in hand, or rather perusals of translations made before, and ask what may be the reason, what the necessity of the employment. Hath the church been deceived, say they, all this while? Hath her sweet bread been mingled with leaven, her silver with dross, her wine with water, her milk with lime? So, at the time, people wondered why the KJV was even necessary as a translation, if there was nothing wrong with the English translations that preceded it. Again, this is the same argument that KJV only purists will use against modern translations today. So again, we see the same arguments that are used against a lot of modern translations was actually leveled against the KJV when it was published. One more. Yet, before we end, we must answer a third cavil, an objection of theirs against us, for altering and amending our translations so oft. Wherein truly they deal hardly and strangely with us, for to whomever it was imputed for a fault, but such as were wise, to go over that which he hath done, and to amend it where he saw cause. Now, people also raising objections to the translators for updating the Bible translation or updating the KJV. However, the translators are saying, if we see a mistake or we can improve a passage's understanding, don't we have an obligation to do so? Again, this is the exact same argument that modern translations use when they come up with their translation. They're making an attempt to, and they're doing the revisions to help make those translations more accessible and understandable to modern readers. It was the exact same goal that the translators of the KJV had. So I found those to be fascinating when you get a chance to read the preface of the KJV. You find this exact same arguments going on back then that you do now. It's really profound when you think about those that are KJV only purists, thinking that the KJV is the only version we should use. It had the same issues back then. So, as you can see, the KJV was not exactly received with open arms at the time when it was commissioned. It, again, received the same type of skepticism. So, although the translators sought to create a translation that would be accepted by all, it can't be understated that the authorized version was created for political reasons. Now, let's go to modern translations versus the KJV. KJV only apologists argue against modern translations. When they argue against modern translations, there's one common dispute that they have. Modern translations have removed certain scriptures from the Bible. Now, technically, this is true, but not the way that you think, or not for the reason that you think. There are definitely verses that are in the KJV that are not, specifically in the New Testament, but they're in the KJV, but they don't appear in modern translations. They're missing. Not necessarily missing, but there's a reason for that. And the reason has more to do with the shortcoming of the King James Version, not with the shortcoming of the modern translations, or the modern translations tampering with the text. The KJV, in addition to using the English translations that came before it as references, like the Bishop Bible and Tyndale's Bible, was translated from two main manuscripts: the Masoretic text, which is the Old Testament Hebrew, and the Textus Receptus, which is New Testament Greek. Now, the Textus Receptus was compiled by this gentleman, Desiderius Erasmus, in 1516. So, the English translations that preceded it would have used his compilation of Greek and Hebrew in order to translate from. Okay? It was used from every English translation from Tyndale to the KJV. However, like I said, he compiled his in 1516. However, between 1629 and 1941, Greek manuscripts older than the ones used to compile the Textus Receptus were discovered. This gave translators more copies closer to the original text to work from than the translators of the KJV and other English translations had at that time. So, this compilation of earlier Greek manuscripts, and Hebrew for that matter, become known as the critical text. So you have the Textus Receptus, which is the old version, and the critical text. All right? Remember, the more manuscripts you have, the more accurate you can make sure the translation is, because you have different copies that you can compare everything to. We talked about that during the history of the Bible. That was the first week of boot camp. Now, when these older manuscripts were found, it was discovered that certain verses that were in the Textus Receptus did not exist in these earlier manuscripts. Or the Textus Receptus, the critical text. So, passages in the Textus Receptus, which the KJV was translated from, were either added later by other scribes or were part of scribers' notes. But they were not always present in the older manuscripts. So, modern translators had a quandary. How do we address the verses that seem to be added later by scribes, but did not appear in these earlier manuscripts? So let's take a look at how they handled these problems. Okay. Acts 8:37 is one of these disputed verses. Now, just so you're familiar, Acts 8:25 through 40 shows us the conversation of the Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. Now, this is from Bible Gateway. Okay? This is from Bible Gateway. This is Acts 37. Here we have the King James Version. All right? KJV says, Acts 8:37. And Philip said, if thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. And he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. This is in the KJV, all right? Now I'm going to the New American Standard Bible. For those of y'all that aren't familiar, this is a modern translation. It's actually arguably one of the most accurate English translations that we have. So, it says, I want you to notice something. It's in brackets, first of all. And Philip said, if you believe with all your heart, you may. And he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. But like I said, this is in brackets. And if you look carefully, there's a footnote right here. There's a little A in superscript. Footnotes, when you read footnotes, figure out what they're about. So if we go to this A, this footnote A, Acts 37, it says early manuscripts, this MSSS is shorthand for manuscripts. Early manuscripts do not contain this verse. V stands for shortcut for verse. So Acts 37, early manuscripts do not contain this verse. King James has it flat out. This one notes the fact that earlier manuscripts than what the King James was based on, this verse did not exist. Now let's go on to the New International Version to see how they treat it. They don't have the verse at all, but they do have the footnote. Again, the footnote says, Acts 8:37, some manuscripts include here, Philip said, if you believe with all of your heart, you may. The eunuch answered, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. But again, it's letting you know that this verse that existed in the KJV does not exist in the other translations. The reason being, the manuscripts that the KJV was based on had the verse, but these translations are based on older, more accurate manuscripts. The older manuscripts did not have this verse. Everybody with me?
Yeah.
So, when you look at modern translations, they're going to handle, there's other verses like this, but they will handle these verses in that same way. Okay? Another well-known controversial passage that's included in the King James, but is missing in the earlier manuscripts, is the longer ending of Mark 16:9 through 20. This is after Jesus passed. Now, after he had risen early on the first day of the week, he first appeared to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and reported to those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they refused to believe it. I'm realizing that this is a lot to read. So let me skip to where I'm trying to get to. I'll skip to 19. So then when the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and preached everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the word by the signs that followed. And they promptly reported all these instructions to Peter and his companions. And after that, Jesus also himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. So like I said, older manuscripts, earlier manuscripts, do not have these verses. So it's in dispute as far as where these verses come from in the King James and the English translations that preceded them. There's other disputed verses as well. You can do a Google search and find them. But as you can see, these verses are not actually missing from the modern translations. Modern translations just handle them to explain why they exist in later manuscripts but don't exist in the earlier manuscripts. Again, the earlier manuscripts would be closer to the original, so in theory should be more accurate. Later manuscripts, which the King James is based off of, not just the King James but Tyndale, Coverdale, Matthews, Great Bible, Bishop Bible, all of these earlier English translations All the ones that the Texas Receptus, which they're based off of, will be a later translation, therefore less accurate. So, in theory, your modern translations are actually more accurate than KJV and the other English translations that preceded them. Okay? Now, again, the good news is these disputed verses do not change one iota the central message of the gospel or the central message of the Bible. As a matter of fact, again, I personally view this as a way that God is continued to be active in preserving his word, because he's actually showing, he's actually allowing us to find evidence to make sure that what we have is what he actually meant. Amen? So, another shortcoming of the KJV is an obvious one that we all know about. It's the use of 17th century English. Now, 17th century English was modern English when it came out. Okay, but for us nowadays, English has transformed over the years. Now, of course, this wasn't an issue when the KJV was first published, but because English has evolved over the centuries, many words have changed in meaning or aren't used at all today. This, unfortunately, not only can lead to people not understanding a verse, but can sometimes lead to people misunderstanding the intent of the verse altogether. So let's take a look at a couple just to show us an example and show the contrast. Now, my KJV folk. Isaiah 27:8. In measure, when it shooteth forth, thou wilt debate with it. He stayeth his rough wind in the day of the east wind. What does that mean? Anybody want to take a crack? Yeah, that's a legitimate question. Anybody want to take a crack at it?
Well, you have to read the entire chapter to get the context.
Fair, but
yeah, I'm gonna try.
Go ahead, give it a go.
So basically, it's saying, when it when it happens, they'll debate with it. Like there'll be controversy around it. But wait, hold on. He stays his reference in the day of the east. He's gonna keep going, even though, you know, there's the opposing force of the east wind.
Okay, let's look at the modern translation. This is the NASB. You contended with them by banishing them, by driving them away. With his fierce wind, he has expelled them on the day of the east wind. Now, does this seem related to that? But they're saying the exact same thing. Again, I'm not knocking this because this was modern English at the time. I'm just showing the contrast. Let's do another one. This is in terms of meaning. Let's take a look. Revelation 6:6. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts, a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see thou hurt not the oil and the wine. So my question is, when it talks about a measure of wheat for a penny, does this mean, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, does this mean that the wheat and barley are expensive or inexpensive?
Expensive.
Okay. And see, you a King James person, so I know you know. How many people say expensive or not expensive? You say it's not. You say it's not expensive. What do you say, Trey?
Expensive? Wait, a measure of wheat.
A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see thou hurt not the oil and the wine.
Yeah, expensive.
Expensive? Okay. Very good. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the 4 living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine. That confused you even more, didn't it? A denarius was worth 1 day's wages. Okay? So, a denarius in the first century, like I said, was worth a day's wages. In ancient times, a person would be able to buy the equivalent of 8 to 10 quarts of wheat with 1 denarius. But this statement in Revelation is referring to a time of extreme inflation, where things are very expensive. Now, for some readers, and my mother mentioned it, a measure of wheat for a penny is not a lot. So some people may incorrectly deduce that this is talking about a time when things were inexpensive as opposed to expensive. So again, this is just showing examples, okay? Because for us today, a penny has different meaning from what it did then. But we can research what a denarius was. Again, it's basically a daily paycheck, or it was a coin representing a day's wages. And it's a little easier to see and to denote the contrast. Now, wrapping up, we do need to understand one truth. There is no perfect English translation of the Bible, King James Version included. The reason being, all of us are individuals. All of us have a different way that we learn and understand. So every one of us will be able to pick apart a flaw in any Bible translation. The only perfect translation is the one that gets you excited. I mentioned this before. The one that you can understand and gets you excited about reading it. Okay? Now again, we did talk about the bad Bible translations. When we talked about the different types of Bibles, we talked about formal equivalent, dynamic equivalent, and paraphrases. So formal equivalent will be those that are direct word as much as possible. Direct word from word translations. King James would fall under this category. Dynamic equivalent would be, so let me back up. Formal equivalent, we have just used it as an example. If you think about translating this particular phrase into another language, we have the English phrase, it's raining cats and dogs, right? So if you want to communicate that thought to another culture, how do you communicate it? Do you tell them it's raining cats and dogs? Now, they have no point of reference. So they're looking up at the sky like, we're the dogs and we're the cats. But a formal equivalent would put it just like that. It's raining cats and dogs, okay? A dynamic equivalent would say something to the effect of, it would try to combine the words and the thought. So a dynamic equivalent will say, it was raining extremely hard, as if dogs and cats were falling from the sky. Okay? A paraphrase would say something like, man, it was raining out that joint. All three have their strengths and weaknesses. My personal opinion, and emphasis on opinion. I would stay away from paraphrases because they are very difficult to study from. So if you want to be able to dig into the Greek and Hebrew, if you want to be able to just do more in-depth study, you can't really do it from a paraphrase. So I normally tell people to stick with formal equivalent or dynamic equivalent, especially if that dynamic equivalent leans more towards formal. And there are definitely some out there. Like the English Standard Version, the ESV is a good one. Christian Standard Bible is a good one. Of course, the NASB, which is what I use for us. The Legacy Standard Bible. There's quite a few of them out there. But for us in America, we're blessed because we have so many good translations that we can choose from. But let me say this again, just for those that are King James only people. And I'm not necessarily talking about people in here. I'm just talking about in general. Okay. As Americans, one thing we have to do is stop thinking American. Christianity is a global religion. Do you honestly think over in China they are reading the King James Version? They ain't. For those of y'all that have been to the Bible Museum, the Bible has been translated into thousands of different languages. And again, they're not even reading translations of the KJV in their language. The KJV is just one drop in the bucket of overall Bible translations, global Bible translations. So when we look at it from a global perspective, excuse me, when we look at it from a global perspective, it's actually kind of arrogant for us as Americans to be arguing over which translation is the God-approved version. Because some people are literally risking their lives just to read the Bible. Again, there's places where the Bible gets smuggled in a page at a time. Congregations, local fellowships, each one of them will read the page and memorize it. And after everyone's memorized it, that page will be destroyed so that no one's caught and killed because they actually have it. Excuse me. We're fortunate because, again, we have all these Bible translations that we can choose from. When you put it in that perspective, it's actually really silly for us to be arguing, oh, well, I read this translation. Well, I like this translation. Again, my goal here is not to bash any translation, but to give you an understanding of the history and the background so that you don't feel judged or feel put upon to read from a specific translation. Again, the perfect translation is the one that gets you excited about reading and that you want to read all the time. Amen.